this man is one of the most highly acclaimed and influential comic book writers of all time. He truly is an advocate for growth, transformation, and for the power of ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, the true rock star of comics, Mr. Grant Morrison.
Thanks a lot. That's very kind of you. I can't express how much that means to me in words, so I'll do it in the form of dance. To me, it just comes down to a very simple equation, is that life plus significance equals magic.
Grant Morrison is the most popular and the most successful comic book writer of his generation, but he's also the most controversial.
You know, he'd get involved in these adventures that just seemed so absurd and fictional almost.
Art and writing are magical things.
I don't know how much of it, what you hear about him is myth and what's reality.
Everybody wants to hear the crazy stories about him.
And maybe the guy walks around his house and like takes out the garbage in a silver suit, but I sort of doubt it.
I'm not going there. The magic stuff.
When you hang out with Grant, you just get like the fucking download.
I went up to him drunk and in tears and basically told him that he had changed my life.
And he does have the image, the glamour. Projects a certain aura.
Because he's iconic, just visually.
He's always had very strong interests in a lot of weird shit.
When he shook my hand and he has these intense laser eyes and his big voice, I was just like, wow.
It almost feels like he's above all of us, looking down at everything and can see the whole.
We, as three-dimensional entities, were interacting with a two-dimensional plane.
Grant's the only guy who knows how to draw hypertime on the back of a napkin.
What you have to remember about Grant is that his greatest creation in a lot of ways is himself.
So it's never going to be me, you'll never get it, you'll never know, and whatever you think I am, that's what I'm not. I grew up as a kid in a fairly poor part of Scotland, in Glasgow. My father had been a soldier in World War II. He'd started as a soldier and then he became a pacifist.
He was a big man, he was a strong man. He had a moustache, looked a bit like Stalin. He was a character. But I'd been up at my grandmother's and one of the last steam trains that ever went on the rails in Scotland came roaring past me. My dad saw me rooted to the ground apparently from the window and ran down, scooped me up. And he said the terror that was on my face and the noise that I was experiencing is why he got really into the whole nuclear war thing, the whole disarmament thing, because he'd seen how frightened I was and the sound, and to him it was the sound of bombs, he'd lived through in the war. He was a political man, he was very political, very driven, do you know what I mean, by the causes. My dad's stuff was all anti-nuclear nightmare brochures, pictures of cities burned out and screaming skeletons and nuclear fallout. Yeah, I was kind of used as a decoy when my dad would go in and he'd kick balls over fences and we'd climb in and he'd pretend that his son was looking for his ball while he would take photographs of these underground nuclear bases. So I saw some really strange stuff when I was a kid. It was like prisoner style things where you'd look down a long tunnel into a hillside and there's little men in carts driving past. Over here to our left, even though we can't really point the camera at it, is RNAS Coolport, which is the home of the Trident missile defence system. This is the place where my dad used to take me when he was doing all his protest stuff. And he actually got into the underground base right over there. And they had things like, they had everyone's coffin, cardboard coffins piled up on the wall. And it was the idea that when the nuclear war came, all the civil servants would have 4 minutes to rush to these hidden shelters
And from there, they would sharpen their pencils and start the world up again. You know, it was insane, the idea that they even believed this could happen. But they actually had stacks of coffins, cardboard coffins that could be folded out, and they had everyone's names printed on them from the electoral register. So they were just waiting for us all to die. So you can see influences of that in things like the Invisibles, the breaking into bases, the underground tunnels, sort of representing the subconscious. And that was my early life.
He grew up during the height of the Cold War, and his parents were activists, and so the specter of the bomb was something that loomed large over his life and his creative career.
Well, my father was getting arrested often for having these demonstrations of breaking into places. So we would have like the men in black turn up at the door, and they turned up one night and said to my dad that if they kept it up he would vanish and never be seen again. And as if to prove it, one of his friends was vanished and was never seen again. The guy got in a taxi one night and no one ever saw him ever again. I just lived daily with the fact that my parents were fighting against the bomb. The minute this thing happened, we would be obliterated forever. And for me, the big thing was discovering superhero comics, because suddenly in superhero comics, here were people who could stop the bomb. You know, Superman could take an atom bomb hit on the chest and just smile and shake it off. So all that's in Flex Mentality. You know, the character's talking about the moment where he realised that the bomb, before it was a bomb, the bomb was an idea. And suddenly that understanding of, okay, Superman's an even better idea, so why don't we make that one real instead of that one?
He was here at the convention a couple years ago, and somebody said, so All-Star Superman 10, does that mean that Superman is God? I said, yeah, Superman loves you. Doesn't that make you feel good? He's a more proactive God.
The first superhero comic I remember reading, I was 3 years old, and it was Marvel Man and Baron Munchausen. And it seems very obvious that that was the first one you would read. It's a superhero and a guy who tells lies, you know, so it's almost like the archetype of the writer is Baron Munchausen meeting a superhero.
Grant's mother encouraged the whole comic thing, and I think she was always into the whole science fiction-y type thing and everything.
You know, it was my mother took me out when I was 8 years old. Not only did she take me to see 2001: A Space Odyssey 3 times, she took me to astronomy classes. Then she took me out one night in the cold, pointed at the star Sirius and said, son, that's where we come from. With no explanation. And just left me to deal with that.
Apparently his uncle was a big reader, loved counterculture type stuff, you know, was a 60s guy, was a Crowley aficionado. So when Grant was growing up, I guess his uncle's library was a place that he found, you know, quite fascinating.
Apart from the spectre of the bomb, everything was fun. Kids used to go out a lot then, so we had our own kids' society that had nothing to do with the adult world, that we weren't told what to do. We made up our own games, we played our own stories. I was always encouraged to read and write and draw and express myself, so there was never any problem. I wasn't one of those guys whose parents threw out his comic books or banned him from reading comics. I was really encouraged to live in fantasy worlds.
In the 1990s, Grant Morrison worked with Frank Quetley to create a series called Flex Mentallo. Flex Mentallo drew upon Morrison's own childhood experiences and combined it with the superhero archetypes.
Flex Mentallo was just this brilliant, complicated idea that he had about story and fact and fiction and how the two are kind of the same thing.
All of the stuff in Flex Mentallo is kind of real. When I had my appendix taken out, I was lying in hospital watching this green light all night, just imagining that it was some kind of alien intelligence studying me as I lay on my bed of sick. The same thing when you see the kid sitting in his parents are playing guitars and singing.
Well, they always reckoned Flex Mentallo was based on Grant's father, Walter.
All that's real, you know, like wanking off to drawing supergirls in the nude, you know, as I would do when I was a young teenager. That was, you know, without a girlfriend, so you draw superheroes, like getting off with each other and stuff.
After childhood, I got to 12 years old, my parents split up, and that kind of fucked with my head a little bit. And at the same time, I made the horrible mistake of I got a scholarship to go to a boys' school. And I thought this was a great idea when I was 12, and then when I was 14 I was going crazy. I was climbing the walls because I wanted to meet girls, and there was just no way of meeting girls. So what happened to me after this kind of interesting, happy, peppy childhood was that I had the worst teenage years. when I finally got out of the boys' school, I was like fucking 19, you know, and I hadn't even been near a girl. And I thought I was just never going to be alive and never do anything, and I'd be stuck in this room for the rest of my life. And at that time, I really got into comics. I became a proper geek because I had nothing else in my life. So just for years and years of teenage wasteland, you know, I was sitting reading comics and drawing comics and making up stories as a way to escape.
You'd be excused for thinking that the characters featured here had been dreamed up by a top comic strip writer and had been drawn by a professional cartoonist. But they are, in fact, the brainchild and the work of a local 16-year-old artist. They're part of the hobby that has grown into a whole way of life for Grant Morrison of Corker Hill. As he'd been keen on drawing since an early age, he began sketching some of his favorite characters and found he had a talent for it. Soon he progressed to creating his own characters and gave them names like Monad and Luck of the Long. Now, with the help of two young friends, he produces complete stories in comic form, featuring his own heroes. Grant says of his own artwork, "I create superheroes because I think people want to read about superheroes just now." Grant has no set formula for his comic strip stories. "I think up a basic plot and make up the story as I go along," he explained. He says, "I'm hoping to take up art as a career. If that doesn't come off, I've nothing else in mind." A lad with a great future is Grant Morrison.
I wanted to go to art school, and that was like my big thing. I thought, at least if I get to art school, I'll meet people, I'll hang out and I'll have fun, and they just didn't let me into art school. And I got the rejection letter through, and just, that was like the end of the world for me back then. I just thought I was never getting out of the house, I was just going to be stuck in there forever.
He didn't drink and take drugs or anything like that. That came later.
I was just drawing comics and making up stories, doing nothing else. I didn't go out at night, I didn't do anything. That gave me a kind of a sympathy for geeks, because I was like a super geek, you know, and so I can understand how people feel when they're in that position, and how things like comics and fantasy can get you out of that and give you something to aspire to, something to live up to. I really felt that they'd saved my life in a lot of ways, which is why I love them so much and why I keep going back to them and kind of trying to make sure those worlds are kept alive and kept vital.
If I had superpowers, the last thing I would do is go out and get a suit. Whereas for Grant, that's the first thing. He would have a huge cape and the collar and everything.
So I had a whole bunch of material, and I went to a comic convention in Glasgow, and there was sort of a bunch of hippies who were trying to put together this magazine, Near Myths.
Grant Morrison's first published work was in 1978 in Near Myths, which was an anthology series. Morrison was only 17 at the time, and he was writing and drawing his own comics. In that anthology, he wrote and drew a character called Gideon Stargrave, who was a psychedelic dandy. That character would later reappear in Morrison's Invisibles as kind of an analog for Morrison himself.
And it was just really weird, time travelling, you know, guys walking along haunted, desolate streets looking for ethereal girls.
He seemed very quiet and shy, and to see the work being produced by a 19-year-old at that time, I think was impressive.
And they hired me straight away and said, we'll give you £10 a page, and that just seemed like, you know, that was like a fortune for me. That was real proper money.
In addition to comics, one of the things that Morrison's known for is his interest in magic, specifically chaos magic. The idea that by believing in something, you can make it real. And he'll talk about the rituals he'll perform, and then seeing if they produce results in the real world. And for Morrison, they have.
You would look at things one way, but he would always look at them from some other abstract dimension, or imagine it this way. You know, I mean, he always had that.
First time I tried a magic ritual, I was 19, and I'd been given a book by my Uncle Billy, who was interested in Crowley, and he was the same guy that sort of gave me my first comic books. So he was a big formative influence. And I was kind of a disempowered kid, so I felt I wanted something that would give me some agency in the world, and magic seemed like a pretty cool thing to try out. First thing I did was a kind of invitation to magic. I just did this thing to, okay, let me in, I want to be part of this. I was really cynical, I don't believe any of this stuff. I've never seen ghosts, I've never seen anything. My mother was quite witchy, she read tea leaves, but nothing of that seemed to have come through to me. I was just totally down-to-earth kid. I tried this ritual, I did the whole thing, I got the candles out, I did the magic words, I did the circle, I did the banishings and all that stuff. And I stopped and I went to bed, and then this thing happened when I was lying down. And right in front of me there was a kind of gravitational point in the air in the room which was drawing all the perspectives towards it as if there was a hole there or a crack. And there was the sense of black oil filling up the folds between the brain. I just freaked out and called on the gods of my mum and dad, you know, Jesus, they would get me out of this one. And the whole experience ended after a little bit. And then there was this vision of a lion's face which started to announce stuff. So it seemed pretty convincingly Crowleyan to me that I'd actually somehow activated whatever it was he was talking about.
Grant's take on magic for the most part has been to say, it's really easy, you just do this and results will happen. I did it and it happened for me.
And that's what I was interested in, the nuts and bolts of it, not whether it was an angel or a demon, because I don't believe in angels or demons, to tell the truth. I believe there are things that we can manifest as angels and demons or project onto, and really all magic is about is enchanting the apparent chaos or, you know, of ordinary matter around us with meaning.
There's probably nobody on earth you want to learn more about magic or expanding your consciousness than Grant Morrison.
That was my lifelong interest. I kept trying it out and doing things. It's just weird stuff you can't explain, but you look back at it and say, okay, something happens when you start on that path and you start thinking that way and you start doing these things. The world seems to adapt a little bit around about.
The magic gave him the confidence to join with a few friends and start a band.
That was it. I formed a band and just started to live and get out and dress up and be the person I always wanted to be.
It was kind of psychedelic, kind of garage rock and roll, about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and just that kind of pebblesy, electric prunes. It's very 60s influence.
I was into punk, I was into the Beatles. I grew my hair out like in Beatle hair. And I started wearing what now would be regarded as Austin Powers style clothes. The Gideon Stargrave character that's in The Invisibles, that was how I looked back then. I had one of those red military guardsman's jackets and the shades.
Fairly kind of dandy-ish, in a kind of very skinny Oscar Wilde kind of way.
I used to go to a place called the Rock Garden, and it would just be, I'd carry my tarot cards around, and so if anybody wanted advice, I'd pull out the tarot cards and do stuff. So I was kind of just like a mod shaman around town for a little while in Glasgow.
Even in the Zenith synopses, he was referring to his own research into magic.
People would come in and say, I've split up with my boyfriend, and I'd pull out the tarot cards, and I didn't even read tarot cards, I just used to wing it. And it tended to work. But unlike Gordon Gowdy, he lost a guitar.
This guitar, which was the only guitar I had, it got stolen from the Glasgow School of Art, and Grant says, I'll do magic and I'll get your guitar back.
It had this click in my head, which always had this super certainty when I knew magic was going to work. And it came on in my head, and I just said, oh no, you'll find it within a couple of days and it'll be very close to the house. I had no idea, I was absolutely sure.
I kind of disbelieved the thing, and I was like, yeah, the guitar's still not here, and Vladimir goes, it's really close, it's really close.
And a couple of days later he discovered the guitar hanging in the window of a pawn shop, like right round the corner from where he lived, so he was able to retrieve it. And for a little period then I was kind of doing stuff like that, just to test the magic, to see if it worked. And there was a certain run of it where it just felt so natural and so normal that these things would happen spontaneously.
Other than Captain Clyde, which was a superhero comic strip that he wrote and drew for the Scottish newspapers, and Star Blazer magazine, which he contributed to, he didn't do a lot of comics work in the early 80s.
I was making money off comics, but I just wasn't putting an awful lot of effort into them because I thought the band was going to happen. Despite the fact that we had a lot of really good singers, we had great songwriters, and we did really good songs. We weren't great musicians, but we had a lot of enthusiasm. The trouble is, everyone was coming from a similar place of damage. You know, we weren't very good at being a band. We didn't know how to deal with groupies, and we just used to send them away scared. So it was really, we were a kind of crappy band, but we looked beautiful and we sounded really great.
The thing is, I could never understand it because he was handsome, he was good looking, and girls liked him. But he just seemed slow at coming forward. He seemed sort of unconfident within himself or something.
I also took a job in the civil service for a year where I sat behind a desk wearing all this ridiculous 60s finery in an office and tried to be a filing clerk. And I just decided after a year of that I would never, ever, ever work again.
So I decided the only way to do that is to get back into comics and take it really seriously. The band was more fun, but ultimately I realised that the only hope I had of doing anything meaningful was to break away.
I think he was only at that stage making his mind up whether he wanted to pursue a career as an artist or as a writer.
Ultimately I wanted to just tell stories, and I didn't want to draw other people's stuff, and that was the kind of work that was being offered the more I got closer to the actual comics mainstream. So I was kind of forced into a choice, and I decided to be a writer because it allowed me to tell more stories and get more work done and get more out of my head onto the page.
Fortunately at the time the magazine Warrior had just come out, which had Alan Moore's revival of Marvel Man and V for Vendetta.
In the early to mid 80s, when Morrison was away from comics, Alan Moore came into the picture, really changed the nature of comics. It took comics in a much darker, much more mature, much more adult direction.
I remember reading V for Vendetta and thinking, this is what I wanted to do, this is the way comics should be. So one of the first things I did was go down to see Des Skin in London, the publisher of Warrior.
He was such a quiet, unassuming kind of guy when he'd come into the office. He was more like a fan than a professional, you know, very, very shy, very timid seeming. But his work was the absolute opposite. It was totally out there, even his early stuff.
And I'd taken this story, which was a kind of Kid Marvel Man spec script, and he bought it straight away. So again, it was a really good jump for me.
And I thought it was a really nice little 5-pager. But Alan, like any creator, I guess, who owns material, didn't want anybody else touching his material.
Then Alan Moore had it spiked and said it was never to be published. So thus began our slight antagonism that's persisted until this day.
Alan Moore, he's very disdainful of the whole medium, except for the work he produces. Morrison tends to poke fun at that sort of thing.
Alan kind of is at this pedestal, and Grant just has to poke at him. I kind of get that feeling sometimes.
They asked me to continue Marvel Man because Moore had fallen out with everyone in the magazine and taken away his script. And they said, would you follow this up? And to me that was just like, oh my god, you know, the idea of getting to do Marvel Man, following Alan Moore. I'm the only person in the world who'd really do this right, and I was well up for it. So I didn't want to do it without Moore's permission, and I wrote to him and said, you know, they've asked me to do this, but obviously, you know, I really respect your work and I wouldn't want to mess anything up, but I don't want anyone else to do it and mess it up. And he sent me back this really weird letter, and I remember the opener just said, I don't want this to sound like the softly hissed tones of a mafia hitman, but back off. And the letter was all, but you can't do this, you know, we're much more popular than you, and if you do this, your career will be over. And it was really quite threatening, you know, so I didn't do it. But I ended up doing a little bit of work for Warrior.
What I saw in his work was a almost fully formed, straight out of the box professional comics writer. There wasn't the slightest hint of amateurishness in those scripts of his that I read.
2000 AD was the biggest magazine of the day in England. And he created the first superhero for 2000 AD, Zenith. And it was based on the idea of the superhero as pop star. And he created this, what ultimately became a 4-part saga that drew the attention of American publishers.
DC started to recruit because Alan Moore's Swamp Thing had been very successful. They said they gave me a call, and it was one of those moments where I said, oh my god, DC Comics just phoned me. So I went down to London for one of the first big summit meetings they had, and it was the same meeting they discovered Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman and Peter Milligan and all those people.
He was very shy, extremely shy, but he was a good talker, and when we finally could understand what he was saying, pitched a number of ideas. One of them was Animal Man.
I went down in the train and had no ideas. I came up with Animal Man, who was a character I'd loved as a kid because he was really obscure and I was the only kid who knew who he was. I kind of had a slight emotional connection to that character, and I thought, what could I do with that? What would fit into DC's kind of reviving our superheroes mode?
He pitched a very sort of real-world scenario with this crazy character.
So the first 4 Animal Mans were done as a kind of sub-Moore approach, because I thought that's what Karen wanted, which she kind of did.
I first read Grant's work on Animal Man #1. I recognized the character from like Who's Who and stuff, and I read that first issue and I was blown away. That was like one of the best comics I'd ever read in my life.
What happened was the first 4 issues were accepted. They took them on, then they said, we want you to develop this as a comic. So suddenly it became a lot more real, and I didn't want to just follow that same path.
So instead of taking superheroes and making them more like the real world, which was the Alan Moore approach, he takes the comic book world and overlaps it with our world and tries to bring our reality towards the comic book reality.
I didn't think it was right for superheroes to be burdened with real world problems. I was more interested in going into their world. I wanted to find out what it was like in there, where the sky was always blue, where everything was primary coloured, where time was represented by boxes and you could cut between one moment and 10 years over the space of a gutter. So again, that's why I always thought my agenda and my project was so different, because I felt that Moore was about bringing the grit and the grime into superheroes' lives and hurting them and kind of messing them up and exposing their futility and their frailty. And to me, it's like, I don't want to expose the futility and frailty of one of the last great ideas that we have.
Well, Grant has a different kind of knowledge in the DC universe. Grant actually, it feels like Grant, when he talks about it, has lived there, has been there.
That allowed me to stake out new ground that, the other big names weren't really covering at the time. And I'm still doing the same kind of stuff, I guess.
Grant Morrison had been writing Animal Man for a couple of years, and by the end of his run, he actually appeared as a character in the series.
It was the early attempts to just appear on the page and talk to the character and say, look, I'm the guy who made you, I'm the guy who killed your family. I'm sorry about it, but we need drama. We've got people up here clamouring for their comics every month, and if I have to kill your family to sell a few more episodes, then sorry, I'm going to do that. And to also have Animal Man then saying, well, can you bring him back? And I was like, well, that's not realistic. Nobody's going to believe that. And then doing it, because the realisation was that in a comic, you can do it. His wife and family could be sat back on the seat as if nothing had ever happened. Only in fiction is that possible. You can break the rules of physics and time and space and life and death, and that's quite profound.
I felt like when the Beatles first discovered hallucinogenic drugs, and then it blew my mind and changed my concept of what you could do in superhero comics.
What's really interesting is the fact that these long-running universes have a weight and a reality of their own, which is bigger than mine. I wasn't alive when Superman was having his first adventures. I'll be dead and he'll still be having adventures. So there's a certain element of that continuum we've created which is much more real than the one we live in. The process back in the 80s and in those days was just, it was easier because I didn't have so much work. Animal Man or Doom Patrol, I had an entire month to write those comic books, and I used to spend an entire month doing it. So a great part of the day was me just walking about the streets and going up and down the canal and having vague, romantic thoughts. Looking at things around you and thinking about how they got there, how they're made, thinking about how everything is the way it is and how you fit into it. And it was a way of kind of enchanting the landscape. And as the walk goes on, you try to lose yourself in it. You try to almost forget where you are until the stream of information becomes almost unconscious. And things start to talk and to have meanings and to have connections. The comics tend to start in things like this, which is a particularly cheap version of things like this. Usually they're a bit more sturdy, but this one says it all about the current chaos of life. And here is little sketchy illustrations. The artists never see these unless it's a specific layout that's hard to describe in words.
Quite often he might send along a little thumbnail sketch of a particular design.
This cover here is obviously recognisable as Frank Quitely's cover for Batman and Robin #1 in its very infant ideas stage, and he takes that and does something so much better and much more accomplished than that.
I really like the challenge of an open-ended cover, where you can do what you want, or you have to base it on some sort of idea. But equally, it's really nice when somebody actually gives you a drawing they've done, says, do that, that's what I want.
But one of these books lasts about a month or sometimes a couple of months, so as you can imagine there's quite a lot of them. The interesting thing is that sometimes I find books like this and there's a better version of a story that's been published in it that I've completely forgotten about. Notebooks are always with me. I have to have one all the time because every stray thought goes in these. There's just little lines, there's stupid names for things. All fire is the same fire. Sounds like an Alan Moore quote, but there it is. I don't even know what that means. A black mask, renegade costume, could be anything, Once you get past having written one of these, you've no idea what you were talking about when you look back at them. Yes, I saw the Earth remade with my own eyes. There you go. From there, just go straight into work on the script.
He's seen it in his own head and he's worked it out to be paced this way and to fit into this size. It works. It's just a question of taking that and then trying to make those words that he's described his vision with, work in pictures.
Usually I've got notes, I've got kind of breakdowns. If it's a 12-issue series, I try and work out the entire 12 before I start. When I sit down and I'll work out the entirety of The Invisibles, the 6 years of it. But having said that, I didn't know what the last sentence in that book would be until the very last page when I got to it. And suddenly it was, oh, okay, our sentence is up.
So yeah, I mean, it starts in the notebooks, it goes straight onto the computer and out to the artist.
He tells me the story, then I tell the readers the story, which is, I think, the way it should work anyway.
Speaking to an artist friend, and he couldn't believe that you could start in comics with drawings, convert them into text, and then send them to an artist to reconvert them into drawings again, but different drawings.
After Animal Man in the late 1980s, Morrison gained more prominence. When he would show up to conventions or in articles about him, he began to develop his reputation as an oddball, as someone who was different, as someone who was writing comics that maybe didn't quite make sense.
You're the weird one, Pigeonhole. It's such an easy, cheap pin to put on somebody.
Back in the day, I used to go to these comic conventions and I couldn't identify with the people in comics.
I think Grant liked having somebody with him in a way to draw the attention off him back then. He turned up at one comic convention with Adamant.
He wore like a cap, leather cap, sideburns, dark hair, little rose-tinted glasses.
I've previously described him as looking like a negative zone Andy Warhol. I think Grant was unique in that he was very conscious of image as a comic book creator. We were so used to dealing with the sort of dyed-in-the-wool traditional comic book writers that the appearance of Grant looking dapper and sharp at a Marvel UK Christmas party, probably we didn't know what to say to him.
Yeah, I felt like an outsider, and you can see it in Animal Man, you can see it particularly in Doom Patrol.
They gave me the Doom Patrol title, and obviously Doom Patrol had started out at DC as the world's strangest superheroes, and it was more a case of just thinking, what is currently strange that I can expose these characters to? And for me, what was strange was just all the new stuff that I was getting into, which was like situationism and surrealism and Dada.
These were superheroes that you wouldn't want to actually be. You don't usually find someone who wishes they could be a brain in a tin can or somebody with, 64 personalities.
It was kind of about the people I was hanging about with, like just fuck-ups, people on medication, artists, crazy girls who made beautiful sculptures but then spent the rest of the night crying. I was trying to, again, mythologise that experience, the experience of Bohemia through superheroes.
Finding Doom Patrol was one of those life-changing moments, realizing there are other weirdos like me out there.
So I kind of set out deliberately to write comic books that were chaoses that we had to make sense out of. Life causes all manner of confusion. I think stories should as well.
In the late 80s, Morrison was working on Animal Man and Doom Patrol. Both of those series were great, critically acclaimed, but they weren't starring popular characters necessarily. But then he comes out with Arkham Asylum, which features Batman.
A friend of mine and I had been thinking about and talking about, just if imagine you got to do Batman, this is what we would do.
It's not sitting there relying on being this pulpy action thing. That's what most people expect out of Batman, and here he's giving you this psychological drama.
But it got published just at the time that Tim Burton's Batman movie was coming out, and so the sales in this thing were immense.
I still remember calling Grant and Dave up and telling them what their royalty check was.
And she just said, "You're rich." That was the first thing she said. And they'd sold 120,000 on the first day, and I was getting $1 on each book.
It was the book that really made his career.
It just felt brilliant, because I'd been years of assuming that I'd always just be in the same position, stuck in Glasgow with no money.
He left comics behind for a while to travel and experiment and to just see what life had to offer.
It took me until I was 30 to decide I'm going to start drinking, I'm going to start taking drugs, I'm going to see what life is like for other people. And so my whole life kind of blew apart, and I split up from the girl I was with and started doing all this other stuff.
And when he broke with Judy and he went around the world and stuff like that, that's when he changed. That's when I noticed the change in him.
The night before I did the round the world thing, and I was in a little travel lodge motel thing outside Heathrow Airport, and I thought, well, this is it, I'm going to go around the world now. Nobody I know can see me, so I'll shave my head at last. I did it, and I just thought, fuck, this looks great.
The writer that I met in 1985 was far quieter, less outgoing, less sure of himself, I think.
From being like the Doom Patrol, where I felt like a real outsider and no one understood me, suddenly I was travelling around the world, flying to San Francisco to meet people that seemed interesting, or suddenly I was going to fetish clubs.
And I'd done things I didn't think I could do. If I'd imagined them back home, I'd never have left home because it was too scary or too weird, but being in those situations, I found that I could deal with them, and it just made me feel bigger and more expansive and more capable of doing more things that I hadn't done before.
He really, came out of his shell.
what was it Rambo called it, the complete and systematic derangement of the senses. That was my goal at the time, to see how close I could get to the complete and systematic derangement of the senses. It was always done in these ridiculous experiments for me, so when I decided to see what drink was like, I bought a whole bunch of different drinks, starting off with really cheap cider and then working my way up to champagne. And every day I would just pour a pint and drink the pint, which was nuts, you know. So I thought, okay, what's cider like? Pint. Oh, that's interesting, you know. And then the next day it would be like, what's wine like? But I suddenly realised then, this is kind of interesting, you know. I feel a bit loose now. I feel a bit kind of disconnected from all those old problems that I once had because I'm now drunk. And then with a couple of friends, we got into the whole magic mushrooms thing for a few years. And there's a little bit of that in Doom Patrol, the stuff about the insect mesh and that, the other planet stuff is all magic mushroom trips.
He said, there's this most beautiful place we have to show you.
Me and my friend Ulrich took her up the mountain where we used to harvest our mushrooms.
Grant said out loud to everybody, can anyone else manipulate matter? I concentrated and I felt like, you know, oh, I'm finally Jean Grey from the Phoenix. And I went, yes, I can. And it was sunset, which was beautiful. And then I was realizing we have to climb down this mountain. When we rushed down to the bottom, there was no one. It was just nature around us and a little bench. And Grant said, you know what's happened? We've been like Rip Van Winkle. We've been up that mountain for 100 years. When the bus comes, it's not going to have any wheels. It's going to fly with rockets coming out of it and spacesuits. We've been just trapped in a time bubble, and the world has passed us by, and everything we know is completely changed.
I came past his room to see if he wanted a drink, and it took a while for the door to open, and when it did, it creaked open slowly, and I could see Grant, who appeared to be wearing nothing but a grey blanket, tugged over his head. I said, do you want to come out for a drink? And he said, no, I'm writing. I'm having breakthroughs. And then the door closed again, and the thing is, I didn't see him touch it. It just closed all on its own.
He's making that bit up. I should add to these stories rather than debunk them, but I'm trying to tell the truth.
He had a kind of reputation for being mischievous, shall we say, in his work and socially.
So I just started going out dancing and doing lots of stuff that I hadn't done before. And that became kind of the meat of the comics. Back early in the 90s I was doing the whole tranny thing and going out and dressing like that just to see what that would be like.
If I'd gone over the edge as much as him, I'd be institutionalized. I'd be gone.
You know, when I talked about the first demon or angelic experience, it came across as a very slight visual distortions. On drugs, you had the demon in the room, you know, with its multiple heads, 10 tails and flailing barbs. In 1993, I went on a tour for some of the early Vertigo stuff. I was there with Steve Yo and Jill Thompson, and we went along to the 50 years of LSD celebrations, which were going on in San Francisco that night.
Someone said, you guys want to go to this rave tonight? Dance and dance and dance, you can feel the music.
Just having a good time, really.
And suddenly out of this night came, hey, let's do a comic together. Come on, let's save the world. So I tried to come up with something that encompassed all the stuff that interested me, the fashion, the music, the mythology, the counterculture stuff. Something like The Invisibles is the ritual, it is the spell.
The Invisibles was a sci-fi kind of dimension-hopping super spy conspiracy thriller that was heavily influenced by his own life.
The comic to me is real, so my interaction with The Invisibles was very literal, and for me I had to become a character in order to write about those things.
He puts himself into the comic book Invisibles as the character King Mob, this ultra-sexual, ultra-powerful avatar for Grant.
The things in The Invisibles are all based on real experiences. Made myself look like the lead character. I started to go to places he would go to and hang out with people that he would meet.
The way that he connected what felt like was happening in the zeitgeist and what was happening day to day in the 90s to such a giant science fiction story made it feel like it was a story about your life.
As Morrison was writing The Invisibles, he practiced a basic form of magic called the sigil, and he actually taught his readers in the letters page how to perform sigils.
And it's a really good entry into magic because it's very simple. So I picked up on it because it seemed to be something that worked. To construct a simple sigil, write down your desire in the form of a sentence, then take out the repeated letters Take out the vowels and you'll be left with a string of consonants. Then take those consonants and rearrange them and mash them together until you've got something which doesn't look like your original sentence, which is its own little glyph. The idea is that you activate the sigil, and that's where it gets to be fun.
Look at that sigil, meditate on it, and masturbate.
While you're staring at the sigil and at the peak, pour all your concentration into it, and hopefully and generally you will find that the thing you wanted will slowly enter your life.
He says something and then somehow events align themselves to make it what he's after.
I used to just do them to meet people and to kind of get off with girls. Cured a couple of friends of herpes by using the sigil. The notion was in The Invisibles to extend the sigil concept into areas of plot and narrative. When I started the sigil that became The Invisibles, I did it by doing a bungee jump from a bridge in New Zealand. It was the way of charging the sigil using absolute terror, because it was absolutely terrifying until the moment we actually jump, and then it becomes ecstatic.
If you make something that gets seen by a whole lot of people, you can impose your ideology on them. You can bring that idea into the world, and that is making magic. I
hate stories that are just stories. I can't relate to stories that are just somebody's making something up. I like a story that's actually meaningful, that's coming out of life or coming out of an emotion or has some weight behind it.
The boundary between the imaginary or the supposed and the real was going to become much more permeable.
A lot of people like to characterise Grant as a space case and a nutter. What people don't realise in large part because they're not listening is that he's extremely practical and pragmatic when he talks about his alien abduction, when he talks about magic. It's all about the practical method to make something happen. In his completely insane and unreasonable way, he is actually completely reasonable and pragmatic about these things.
As he was starting to write The Invisibles, Morrison traveled to Kathmandu, and he had a completely transformative experience, something that he later termed an alien abduction.
There was the stairs there, which was 365 steps, and if you could climb them on one breath, then you were guaranteed enlightenment. We got some tickets for Kathmandu and left, and we did the thing, so we ran up the stairs, no problem. So we figured that's it, enlightened in this life. The job is done. A couple of days later, I was sitting on the top of the Vajra Hotel. I was actually writing the instruction for the Invisibles when the experience happened. There is a break that says, shit, I've just gone away and the most profound experience of my life has happened. But the temple began to look like a machine. So it was pumping this spiritual energy, and it was getting quite profound. These things came out of the wall, like these silvery blob guys were saying, where do you want to go? And the first thing I could think of was Alpha Centauri. And suddenly there was this collapsing Stargate kind of effect, and I wasn't in my body anymore. There was 3 suns. There was a planet that was kind of blue and green. So they said, right, we're going to take you off the surface of the space-time continuum now. Ready for this one? And I got peeled off 4 dimensions of space and time. They said, we'll show you what's going on. What we do is we create universes because only in time can you grow things. Things here are eternal, so we can't make new ones unless we build time.
In the second to last Invisibles, we see Jack walking along, leaving a trail of after images that's him through time, stretching back all the way through his life. Pull out further and you see every single human life represented this way, not only in the present, but in the past. We pull even further back, and now we're outside of time. We see time represented as a 4-dimensional crystalline structure.
In order to get here today, you had to be yesterday. And you also had to be 10 years old and 9 years old and 5 years old, and everybody had to wind their way back through down into their mother, and then their mother winds her way back into her mother, and the whole thing connects as one continuous activity. And I spent the 6 years afterwards trying to probe what that meant and what had just happened, what was going on in my brains, through the Invisibles.
When he's talking about alien abduction, it's more of a metaphor of an awakening, of an awareness, of a sense of the layers of reality. And I think that's the same experience that we can get from reading his comics.
Grant writes very basic comic book scripts. In terms of format and structure, they're really no different than any other comic script. I think people expect them to be these sort of insane missives on the world and the world that he lives in, and they're really not. They're very sort of structured, formal scripts. What makes a Grant script different is what he's asking people to draw.
My reactions when I get a new Grant Morrison script, my reaction upon first reading it is, oh my God, how am I gonna do this?
Oh my God, how am I gonna draw this? It's like trying to draw a sunset or something like that. You can't capture all of the different aspects or the other sensory inputs.
I guess if there's a difference in Grant's scripts, there's just so much information. I often would just write him and make sure I had the important points in there so that I didn't miss anything.
He would say the character opens the door and there's a blob of mirror matter behind it. He wouldn't put the character opens the door to see the most amazing sight ever. You know, mirror matter, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. He was very matter of fact about it.
Nowadays, Morrison has close collaborations with people like Frank Quitely and J.H. Williams.
It was important for me to talk to him, and so we just started having conversations over the phone. And I remember him talking to me about conversations with the characters.
When it flows, I hear them talking, and they're talking and they're saying what they're saying it in their voices. When I don't hear that, I have to reconstruct it just as a writer, using writerly tools. Yeah, I don't think anybody would ever know the difference, but for me it's not as good as when you start to hear, oh God, there's Scott Summers, and it sounds just like Scott Summers. Quick, write that down.
Other artists just get the Morrison script and then do their own thing with it.
Some people I speak to quite a lot, like Frank Quitely. We live nearby and we're friends.
We three, I think, it's the most collaborative in terms of actually you breathing down my neck and telling me that it's not different enough, and it's not good enough, and it's not new enough.
Other guys, I just trust them so much, you know, like Cameron Stewart, he's brilliant. I hardly ever get in touch with him. I feel terrible. I should get more in touch with Cameron.
The only contact I have is generally through email, and even then, it's not usually with Grant himself, it's with his wife, Kristen.
I want to be able to trust my co-pilot to work well. And I don't want to be hanging over the shoulder or be in control.
I actually never speak with Grant while I'm working on his books.
I like to kind of reinforce the mystery of it. You know, maybe he's too busy communing with like kind of forces of the universe to kind of like start typing on a MacBook or whatever.
How you doing? I'll just say hello to you for 5 seconds.
Yeah, another 5 seconds.
We'll meet each other next year. I'd never tell him to change anything even if it's wrong. The mistakes are as cool to me as the things that work.
I think when he's working on the corporate trademarks, the big Marvel characters, the big DC characters that he works on, he has a responsibility to those trademarks and to that corporation, obviously. So those works are not as transgressive as perhaps his other work, his more personal work is. But still, these ideas do get smuggled in. You know, you have to look at Grant's work as like it's a bullet with a candy coating. You know what I mean? It's the kind of thing that a kid can read it, their parents will never be the wiser that their kid's getting their mind good and fucked.
I mean, I really thought I wouldn't do superheroes again. I just wanted to do The Invisibles and things like it. But I got a real yearning for it.
JLA was a very strange book in that basically DC Comics gave Grant Morrison, a man known for more introspective, weirder projects, and they kind of gave him the keys to all their biggest cars.
I'm a headliner, closing the show. I'm the realest. Coffee.
And with Justice League, I just thought, I want to just do a big old superhero comic the way I think they should be done, like huge ideas, imagination. Let's throw out all this stupid dark stuff and the realism of it.
So they kind of came in, here's Batman, here's Superman, here's Wonder Woman. Pretty much the first time that they've been put all together with a major comic book writer.
Do you know, at the time I was like tripping out my box most days, so I was getting a lot of really good ideas for superhero stories. The Invisibles was quite intensive work and it was very involving. Justice League, I could just go away and cleanse my palate with some crazy stories that would allow me to play with my favourite toys and giant beasts and hyper-dimensional entities and all the things I were into, but taking down the level into the idea of the adventure story.
I remember he'd get involved in these adventures that just seemed so absurd and fictional almost.
If I wanted to write about voodoo, I wasn't just going to read a bunch of books. I would have to interact with voodoo Loa to see how it felt, so that I could do it in a way that was actually honest. By mistake, this one night I found myself in the palace of the Scorpion gods, and it was horrible, just these big things with kind of human faces on bodies. They would tell me I had to get a tattoo at the base of my spine with a scorpion on it, which I gave to King Mob. You know, the things that anyone could do. Anyone can contact Scorpion gods, anyone can talk to John Lennon or Mickey Mouse or or Ganesh.
He was talking about how one time he healed his cat, you know, and when I had a bad experience in my life, the first person I called was Grant, because I was like, I wanted us to do magic. And we did magic over the phone, and I think it worked. I believe in my heart it worked.
I was living it, you know, I'd become the character, I was wearing the clothes, I was going to the places, I was doing the things, I was doing the rituals, I was hanging out with the gods, and then putting it back in the comic, and then being affected by what was in the comic. So yeah, I mean, in terms of reality, that one was the actual deal, you know, that one was bringing me to the verge of death.
When Grant was working on The Invisibles, he got sick right around the time that character got sick.
Just after King Mob had been convinced by the bad guys that he'd been given a necrotizing fasciitis bacteria that was eating through his face, I suddenly get this huge boil on my face, and within 3 days it's enormous, distorted my entire features.
I remember him saying, Steve, look at this, and he like pulled his ear back and there was this hideous kind of green, crusty kind of crater thing behind his ear, and he'd got no idea what it was.
I was sweating constantly, I was getting into fevers and having these like shakes and rigors and then freezing. I just couldn't get up anymore, and I lay in front of the fireplace in my house.
I mean, he thought he was going to die. I mean, he was broken down in tears, and he was delirious, man, delirious.
And suddenly this giant column of light comes through the door. Now, bear in mind I'm hallucinating, but this was one of the most amazing hallucinations I've ever had. And it's Jesus. The first thing he said, which is the thing I put in the comic, just this voice suddenly announced itself. I am not the God of your fathers, I am the hidden stone that breaks all hearts. So then he's saying to me, okay, you're about to die now, but you don't have to die. And I said, look, I really don't want to die. What do I have to do? And he said, well, if you want to stay here, you have to work for us. You know, you have to spread the light, whatever that means.
There's sequences in those issues of The Invisibles that came out of the hallucinatory experiences he had on his sickbed.
And it really felt like I'd been through something that had very closely attached to the comic. That was my shamanic experience, that was my trial, my encounter with death, like I'd forced all my characters to go through.
It's not like, you know, you do a comic where George Bush dies and he's going to keel over in his bed or something. But you write a comic book where you get sick, you know, and who knows it.
When he told me this story, it was very profound, and I could see in his eyes and I could see in his reactions, like it had been a very real experience for him to have survived.
It was really obvious to me then that what I was doing was having a much wider effect and deeper implications in my own life.
There was a disinformation retreat weekend at the Omega Institute in upstate New York, and somebody brought a guitar. And at one point, Grant gave probably a 40-minute impromptu concert.
I'm singing for these gorgeous girls and admiring boys, and I was just like, there he goes. There's the totally self-expressive human, with no doubt, just boom.
And I wanted that to be the experience of the people who read the comic as well, that hopefully sometime in 2010 they'd be sitting there wearing their own clothes that they'd been inspired by, and suddenly they'd be the ones who were being contacted and who were having the experiences, and who would then become the next generation of spear carriers who would, you know, come back and inspire me.
Grant would be off having adventures in India or Jakarta. While he had written some of the stories, he would say, I've seen this most brilliant thing and I'll be sending you photo reference for it. And photo reference never came.
There were times he was out of contact for weeks. We would get the script and then he would be off to Australia or Asia someplace.
I suddenly knew loads of people around the world because of The Invisibles. And I had some friends in Sydney and they said, look, you're going to have to see this film, this will really blow your mind. You're going to get quite a shock.
In 1999, The Matrix comes out, and it's obviously hugely influential. But if you look at The Matrix, a lot of the details, the style of The Matrix, and a lot of the cosmology of The Matrix basically comes from The Invisibles.
Holy shit, you know, this is the same story. They're wearing the same clothes that I'm currently sitting watching this wearing. But the first thing I remember about it is just how much I loved it and thought, what a great movie. And then kind of 2 days later, I was thinking, fuck bastards, you know, they've got really rich by doing my stuff.
I think The Matrix owes Grant Morrison everything. Did I just say that? Wow, I just said that.
And then a little bit after that, I thought, no, this is what you wanted. This was the whole idea of doing The Invisibles as a hyper sigil, so this would catch on and weird Gnostic ideas would get out into the general populace and make them think differently. After that, I realised, yeah, it opened up people to these ideas and they didn't care. You know, I didn't change anything. It didn't create a world of Gnostic superheroes yet.
In February of 2000, I organized an event in New York called the Disinfocon. Douglas Rushkoff gave the keynote speech. I spoke, Paul Lawfully, Robert Anton Wilson, and Grant, who I knew would pull out the stops.
People were getting quite bored at that point in the day and they were starting to fall asleep, so I came on and screamed at them all to wake them up. And it was also because I was nervous, you know, it was a big thing to go on and talk for 45 minutes with no notes, nothing. Okay, I'm pissed, and in half an hour I'm going to come up on drugs, so watch for it.
But it was great because his tongue was loose, and he improvised an amazing 40-minute speech, which is kind of a classic at this point.
He talked about his Kathmandu experience, he talked about the idea of the hypersigil. He basically put into words a lot of the things that he'd been putting into the Invisibles comic.
There is that whole thing where there's a public version of you, and then there's the real person who's obviously a lot more complex and difficult and spiky. So I can see that, and that's a presentation. That's like being in a band. That's performing.
After Grant's speech, a lot of female friends of mine, women who should have known better, I might add, were saying like, "Tell me about that Grant Morrison," or "What about that Grant, huh?" Or "Can you introduce me to Grant?"
But I can't watch it now because it's a performance, and I'm just thinking, Jesus, man, you know, it's like, how did you get away with that?
I thought what he did was effective for the crowd in the situation, but I also felt like I didn't get a real dose of what he could share.
The Verve did that great song at the end of the decade, "The Drugs Don't Work," and that's how I felt at the time. It was just that exhausted, this period is over, you know, the 90s is over, pal.
I know he'd been alone for a long time. I know that he was very lonely, and you know, he'd been traveling the world but not really connected to people in a very close way.
3 strippers came up to my room, these girls that I'd met through the Invisible, big fans of the Invisibles, really smart girls, and we just sat all night drinking champagne, smoking dope and talking about quantum physics. And I thought, right, I'm in a real bad place now if I can sit with 3 stripper girls and all we do is talk about quantum physics, you know, and I don't have a girlfriend right now. What the hell am I doing?
Around 2000, Morrison's attitude changed. It seemed to darken, and you could see it in the comics.
Because the Invisibles was so kind of druggy utopian, and I got to the end of it and I thought, you're not dealing with the reality of some people's lives. In fact, you're not even dealing with the reality of your own life, because I was finishing off the Invisibles, and at the same time one of my cats is dying with cancer and dragging herself about and shitting on the floor. And I hadn't gone out with anybody for a year, so I was in this weird kind of celibate space, listening to the music from 2001: A Space Odyssey over and over. The whole sequence where Hal is dying, that was my favourite shit. It was just a nightmare.
There's a little bit less hope eternal to what he's writing, and a little bit more, here's where things have been left.
The whole 21st century I found really difficult after 9/11, and stuff like just seeing people on the internet. I thought outside there was these beautiful outsiders just waiting to change the world.
Morrison wrote Final Crisis, which was intended to be DC's big event book. It's about these superheroes who are trying to fight against this overwhelming evil. And even though it sold well, readers would go online and complain about how the series didn't make any sense.
And there was like a school of like real animus, like real hostility, like how dare you make me think?
You know, I wanted them to be saved, I wanted everybody to be star children, and suddenly I saw the ugly, yawping faces, and it was such a downer, such a terrible downer.
I'm a super fan of Final Crisis. People complain that it's super fragmented and you can't tell what's going on, but I think the feeling of like if the entire dimension had been invaded, nobody would know what was going on. Shit would be moving really fast. He doesn't give you the information, but he gives you the feeling.
You know, in Final Crisis, the internet, it seemed practically went to war over it. You know, there were people on one side saying, this is genius, this is groundbreaking, progressive, and other people saying, this is gibberish, I have no idea what's going on, this is unfair, you shouldn't be allowed to do this.
There are people who say, you know, he's obscurantist, like, oh, he's just totally drugged out and he just puts whatever, you know, bizarre hallucination he comes up with onto the page and it makes no sense.
How can you think this stuff makes sense? Clearly this stuff does not make sense.
And once people have basically selected what box you live in, there's no way out of it, and no matter how straight or how dull I could make stuff, it would probably still be declared incomprehensible and the work of some raving idiot savant loon.
The way that people talk about Grant and what he's up to and everything, I mean, the fact is that the guy's got where he is by just being a really hard grafter and just staying in and writing and just never giving up.
I mean, something that really annoys me now is when people say, oh, he smokes crack or he's on crack. You know, I've never taken anything like that. Those are dangerous, addictive drugs.
In the early 2000s, Morrison was writing X-Men for Marvel. And in that series, which started out with more of a hopeful, optimistic feel, you could see Morrison's own personal demons kind of filtering through. And by the end of his run on the series, it ended up in a much darker place.
People were revealing themselves to be bastards, and my best friend was splitting off from me and insulting me in the Scottish press and saying horrible things about me. And it was again another horrible, just another knives in the heart of this last 10 years. So my abyss was the same for me, honestly, as the abyss I saw a lot of people going through, or culture going through.
It was after the Twin Towers fell and we're at war and all that, and I'm saying, so, what's our responsibility now to youth? How do we talk about this, and how do we take a stand and all? And he's like, fuck all that. That's adults and their problems, They're never going to listen to us anyway. I don't even pay attention. I don't even care.
I think as a writer, in a culture, all you can be is a barometer of that culture and try and create work which is somehow reflective of all the influences around you. So it's not that I'm sitting down thinking I have to talk about soldiers dying in the Middle East. It just seems to be that you can't avoid these things, and they make patterns. So it was to find a way, how do you get art out of that? And the filth was kind of the start of that.
And yeah, Filth is a dark fucking ride, man. All the glamour and sex and glitz and pop of Invisibles is replaced by horrible things.
I've agreed to draw the filth. The first page I get features the description of a beaten naked woman down on all fours with a funnel up her ass filled with petrol, with someone dropping a match into it. And I thought, oh my God, what have I agreed to?
I was able to look at these kind of quite dark, negative feelings and process them through the work. That side, Dr. Hurt, those were the characters that came out of thinking there are actually people out there who would really want to see you fucked up. They would cheer. And I didn't really think they existed before. I thought ultimately you could make friends with everyone and get them to laugh, and somehow that doesn't, it doesn't work like that. When we were doing Final Crisis and Superman Beyond and Batman, it was about that idea, almost the post-traumatic superhero. The man who's seen it all, done it all, who's come back and still somewhere in his soul he's dragging out this little last iota of hope. And it had to be shown that, okay, this is how it feels to be on the course of absolute yourself. Did you want to go there? Do you want to go with that? Do you want to follow this down? And ultimately at the end to turn around and say, no, of course you don't. What you want is President Superman and multiple worlds and hope. I think it eventually came to an end when my dad died, and suddenly that was like as bad as it got, and the cat died, the ginger cat that was my kind of familiar cat. Everything died at the same time, so it was really this peak of blackness and bleakness. But on the other side of it, the sun rose. How did I meet Kristen? It was Mark Miller's fault. Mark's wife was sort of friendly with Kristen, so she'd come back and she said to Mark, there's a girl in my office who's really into this stuff that Grant's into. She reads Philip K. Dick and she wears sort of fetish clothes and goes out to these clubs, and the two of them should meet. But we did meet, and Kristen's boyfriend at the time was this like 6'5" Matrix dude. I befriended the two of them. But obviously I kind of fancied her, but she had a boyfriend, and her boyfriend could kill you just by looking at you. I'd invited them to a birthday party I was having. So she turned up, and we were getting on, it was pretty cool. So I kind of went home and did this huge ritual to Aphrodite to bring me the person I need. I'm really nuts, I said, please, I'll just bring me who I need, someone I need. And 3 days later the phone goes and it's Kristen. She invited me out, and I went out and she told me that she split up from her boyfriend, and we just got together that day, and that's been it ever since. It was really fairy tale-ish.
I remember when he started dating her, and he was an utter gentleman. He would hold her hand while they walked down the streets. He would open doors for her, and it was a very different image of Grant Morrison than I'd ever experienced. It was not this fantastic, forward-thinking auteur. It was kind of like a boy from Scotland with his girlfriend, and I just found that so adorable.
She doesn't like the idea that maybe she was conjured into being, but it's just, it's the synchronicity highway. That's how things work. You do things, you don't know how they're going to work out, but obviously the strands of our getting on with each other and being friendly had eventually led to this.
Well, in a way, he got married to his manager, or he let his wife be his manager, depending on how you look at it. And it's a really interesting interdependency. He's created a kind of a support matrix around himself to sort of support this after the age when it takes care of itself.
With a lot of creative people, they tend to drift. Kristen is a rock.
She's the business side, he's the creative side. It's a great
It's a great melding, and she understands comics and loves comics.
I think there's something like really healthy about it. I think she probably works very hard because he's such an eccentric, but I think it works for them.
The reason I was able to write The Filth is because once I met Kristen, I was able to go to the places that were really scary because I felt very secure. I felt pretty upbeat. It's quite, oh, that's okay, you know, okay, I can deal with that. Because they're real. They're as real as the dreamy utopian other worlds. The Filth was just about a guy who's a fuck up and is falling apart and his life's collapsing around about him, but the way that looks in his own head is this magnificent structure. If you live in a bad situation, then ennoble it with your imagination. Find even in the cat's shit beauty and magic, because imagination can turn a hovel into a palace.
I guess over the years he's probably become more calm and mellow than he was when he was younger. I think he just has a more mature way of getting his point across now, both socially and with his work.
The idea was transcendental materialism would be to say, okay, you guys, if you don't believe in magic, let's just talk about what science says is factual. And in all of those factual things, you will find gaps that are so immense and psychedelic and bizarre and weird that it's much more interesting. And we don't need the supernatural. We can actually do magic purely using the nuts and bolts and the concrete elements of the world that we live in. It's the stuff your friends can't say, oh, you're only tripping. No, you're not only tripping. We came out of a star, we came out of a big bang that's still happening. Everything became magic and everything flowed in a very different way and it was a lot more grounded. It seemed ludicrous to frame it as magic now because it actually just seemed like reality. Magic seemed like the fashions, the clothes you wear when you're young to try and be cool. I'd just been wearing those clothes to get to this place of understanding, which is really very like, oh, it's just that? Well, that's kind of cool. It's a simultaneous, it's just that, but oh my God, it's that.
Kristen and Grant got married in the mid-2000s. Ultimately, they bought a house together in Scotland, and it was this isolated house where he could just totally work on his creative endeavors.
1863, that's when the house was made, which is quite cool. A lot of stuff that was involved in the kind of magic I was doing at the time suddenly became concretised in the house. When we come up, it was just so, you know, I knew we were going to stay here.
It's really, really awesome old mansion. The view is pretty spectacular, and they're restoring it like room by room.
This isn't narcissism, is it? It's like somebody burning something. It's probably someone burning their husband. So this is what happens if you cross me. This was a stately mansion until I decided to deal with it. And as you can see, there's nothing left that a human could inhabit anymore. And so don't mess with me. I remember going upstairs, being in the room upstairs where I now work, and just thinking that I was going to be here and I'd be here again and I'd been here. Or a sense of absolute familiarity. It's quite a small room, but for me it's just the room I always dreamed of all my life, is to have a little tower overlooking the ocean. Generally I'm in here and the cats are in here, everyone's in here because, as I say, it's the only warm room in the house. This is where the writing happens.
In the 90s, he would talk about what music he was listening to, what country he had just been in. He was meeting people, he was taking in a lot of what was happening in pop culture and he was spinning it back. What he does now is coming completely from his imagination. I don't think it's because he's antisocial. I think it's just he's in Scotland and he works 18 hours a day writing, and he has evolved to a point where he doesn't need input.
The stuff that I'm doing is very hothoused at the moment. It probably reads that way as well. It's coming out of somebody's head rather than someone's experience. Hopefully that stage will end soon, because I'd like to travel again. I'd like to swim through the undersea ruins of Pompeii or something like that. If you could see inside my head, it'd be pretty exciting right now. There's all kinds of stuff going on. It's like the back projection and natural born killers all the time, but sadly you can't see it.
The most surprising thing about working with Grant is that he's so free with his ideas and he's such an easy collaborator. I love the fact that we can talk about physics at a high level, and then 30 minutes later we can be talking about what Crypto's collar is made out of.
The best part is just when you've got your notebook and something new has just come into your head, and it's like the head is on fire. It's like some neuronal activity that's orgasmic, you know. It's the best feeling you can get. and everything's coming. There's all these connections and it's new things and everything feels fresh, and you get a name for something and then you get chapter titles and it all starts to fold together.
He has more ideas in a 2-hour meeting than I have in a 2-year period.
Ideas come every day. I've got notebooks of stuff that would keep me going for the next 40 years, unfortunately, but then I'll have another one tomorrow and another one tomorrow and another one tomorrow. It never ends.
And if you think the comics are dense, you should read the scripts. And I think there's incredibly talented artists that work with Grant that are able to translate those scripts and really present all those ideas fully on the page.
All of that was just that feeling, that orgasmic feeling of connection to something.
My wife and I are emergency doctors, and she'll tell you this is how I unwind after working. So.
Well, brilliant. I'm glad to help.
No, it's great, man.
I'm sure you need it after all that.
In the early 90s, we all knew the internet, something was happening. And there was that sense of incipient revolution or renaissance in his work. And now there's much more acceptance that we've been through something, rather than that we're about to go through something.
We're now being promised every day the ecology will have collapsed in 50 years, there'll be no tigers left, there'll be, most of the species on the planet will be gone. When you've been told there's nothing left and your species is a bunch of useless bastards who don't deserve anything but extinction, suddenly the superheroes are there to say, no, listen, remember you made us. We're your last crude attempts to imagine where it might go right.
And I felt as though there was something in Grant where he wasn't accepting the darkness of the universe, but I think when you talk to him a little bit more, he's racked with the horror of the cosmos. Grant's solution to that was the universe is a cold, empty, miserable place, but in defiance of all of that, the most rebellious thing that you can do is to be happy.
So I'd like to think now we're actually rehearsing something good. We're actually trying to think, what's the best in us? What does it look like? How does it behave? What is the superhero? Because we invented it. It's something we wanted, so what's its use?
His work on Superman redefine the character to some extent. In All-Star Superman, he presents in 12 issues sort of the definitive Superman story.
Grant and I were talking seriously about taking over the Superman books, and we had been approached by DC for our ideas.
And we're talking about going, how do we do this Superman stuff? It's just really, it's so big, it's so hard, how do we get this? And suddenly we looked up and there's this guy walking across the tracks in a Superman costume.
And it's a pitch-perfect Superman costume, and he looks like he just walked off the comics page. I'm not talking about some ratty velour costume with padded muscles. This guy looked the part.
We've got to talk to this guy. This is the shamanic moment. This is the message from the universe.
And he was just sitting there, posed much like on the cover of All-Star Superman #1, just sort of one leg up casually, just sitting there on a rock.
It was just the cape was kind of draped and it was just like really relaxed. Look at this guy. And I'd always thought of Superman as being posed and being constantly stiff and kind of statuesque, and to see the way the cape was draped and the way he just had one knee up and he was kind of leaning on it.
And Grant just started asking him questions about what it's like to be Superman. And the guy, in character, completely in character, just had a conversation.
So I would say to him, so how do you feel about Batman? And he'd think for a bit and goes, well, Batman doesn't really see the light in people like I do. And he would be really serious then about how do you feel about Lois Lane, and he would talk about his relationship with Lois. And I'm just sitting there noting stuff down. So I always tend to see that as a kind of shamanic vision of Superman that came at exactly the right time and kind of informed the whole of what went into All-Star. The sun goes down into darkness and rises again. That's the basic concept of the magical journey. And the sun for me in the work was an All-Star Superman, which is based on an old concept of our sun and kind of exalting that as an inner strength. So there was that, and it was the feeling of, okay, I'm in this kind of mature position. Superman's starting to get closer to me. Superman's the peak of the superhero comics, the original, the daddy of them all. So there's this dad stuff going on.
He talked about the way you would feel if you met Superman, because it would be a bit like a god, a bit like a dad, a bit like a celebrity.
We met Robbie Williams, the singer. He's the biggest singer on the planet. And I thought it was really interesting to be that close to a golden human, and almost godlike. I'd never met anybody like this, an actual star who, when they come into your house, you feel as if you've taken a drug just by them sitting there. And yet at the same time, he's just an ordinary guy trying to deal with his life.
It was exploring that theme again about the importance of story and what story actually means, and how story can be very real because of the way it affects us.
Suddenly I was writing about something that meant something to me, and I could also talk about Superman's father dying, and the whole Jonathan Kent thing, or Jor-El, the idea of losing a world or losing your father, of living up to your father's inspirations. The whole book became about that stuff, and I think that gave it its strength and its spine and the kind of the resonances that it has, and it's what makes it a real book about real things rather than just a superhero slugfest. The consciousness of the reader comes in, and there's this hologram is formed between the creator, the reader, with the comic book in the middle, and the thing comes to life, to the point where people can sit with tears streaming down their eyes at We 3 when there's nothing there except ink and paper.
I cried at the end of We 3. Like, I'm sitting there sobbing over this comic book, this graphic novel. I'm crying on the pages.
That happens because I'm sitting writing it with tears streaming down my eyes, and somehow that's communicated. Just you, there's no one in the world like you, so let's see what you see and what comes out through your head.
It's okay to mess up sometimes.
Yeah, it's good to mess up. Sometimes when you mess up, you find new things and new ways to work.
You got that? All right, what do you say?
Yeah, anytime. And we've shared a few adventures.
A few adventures.
Anything could be said on camera?
Sadly, no. Maybe when we're much older. Shortly before I die. But I won't care what people think. Hopefully you'll be dead before me. I don't mean hopefully for everybody else, just for myself.
I'll try my best. As long as I can be allowed to do them, I'm going to keep doing them, because they let me do anything I want in comics, which is really rare these days. It's very hard to be able to absolutely express yourself in the way you want.
And I remember he came to Comic-Con, and he's being escorted around by 2 security guards, and then him and his wife, and there's like 300 people lined up to get their book signed from him. And we met up at the DC party that night, and he's just like, oh fuck man, it's like out of control. It's like really, it's gotten big.
Yeah, when you're young, you can be a girl, you can be a guy, you can be a clown, you can be a freak, you can be cool, you can be. The older you get, you kind of get forced into just being who you are, which is someone hurtling on their way to the grave. So I don't know, I mean, it's just the next one's whatever the next one is, whatever next big change happens. I'd like after this phase maybe to go a bit crazy again, or I'll go completely mental.
I've lost faith along the way. There have been times where I think, all right, that's it. Now he's off the reservation and he's never coming back, and he never fails to stick a landing. Or, if anything else, fail more brilliantly than anyone else can, and I'd rather read interesting failures than boring, easy successes.
I've gone back to being optimistic, yeah. I mean, in a sense, things feeling better. It might just be me, and I'm seeing the best in the world now that I'm feeling a little bit better. But I think it has to, I've got to go back to my original belief when, in the 90s, when I had my experience that everything was okay, and that we've not to be frightened because it's only part of something much bigger that we will be wonderful. It's starting to feel more real again. To believe that things are going to get better and that we will participate in things getting better is not to hand over to some father from the sky. I don't believe there's any father from the sky. I believe it's just us about to become something else. And if there's anything else out there, they're not fathers, they're not mothers, they're some other fucking weird thing that is, as I've tried to describe in the past, but can't. And I'd really rather ultimately just say that all I've got to offer is that I'm a witness to the events of my life. That's all I know. I know fuck all else. No, why would I tell stories? All I've got is the truth in this world. To say this happened to me, what do you think that means? Because it happened, I saw the demon, I did that and this happened. I'm not lying, this isn't getting me money, I've got money, I'm doing well. In fact, if I shut up, I would be less, I'd have less crap thrown at me. But part of the experience I had was the compulsion to tell everybody. Because you come back, you've got to come back and say, look, what if this is? What if I'm right and the world isn't dying and it's actually just about to be born? So all I can offer is to say, I'm witnessing this shit. I did this. You could do this. Tell me what happened to you. Because if it's the same thing that happened to me, then we're onto something. Well, my final statement, Jesus Christ, love one another and love me more than everybody else.